Today I'm sewing a linen top using a free sewing pattern. This is the Joyce tie front top by Tiana's Closet. The construction of the top is easy. The only difference I would make to the pattern is making each of the ties longer. This would allow for the tie to look more like that of the pattern cover. The fabric that I'm using in this video is an orange striped linen from the Linen Lab. I hope you join me in sewing another beautiful top. Let's get started. Before I sew the front and back pieces together at the shoulder seams, I'm going to finish the shoulder seams separately for the front piece and both back pieces. Then I'll place my front and back pieces right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Sew these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of your front and back facing pieces, then place them right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Here are my front and back bodice pieces opened out at the shoulder seams, and I'm going to place my joined facing piece right sides together with this neckline and pin in place all around the neckline and around the front ties. Then we're going to sew from the notch at the center front, pivoting at the point where the tie begins, sewing all around the tie and all around the neckline, and then pivoting once again to stop at the notch on the opposite center front, sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now where our stitching started and stopped at the center front at the notch, I'm going to clip into that notch to the stitching line but not beyond. Then I'm going to trim my seam allowances in the area that I sewed. And I'm also going to clip into the curves. Then we want to understitch the facing. We're going to turn the facing over the seam allowance of the neckline and stitch the facing to its seam allowance all the way around the neckline. Your presser foot won't allow you to understitch the entire area that we stitched previously, so just understitch as far as you can. Then we can turn that facing to the inside of the garment and turn the ties right side out. And then give the facing and ties a good press. Now that that's pressed, I'm going to finish my center front seams separately, starting from where we clipped into those notches all the way down to the bottom of the garment on both sides. And while I'm at my serger, I'm also going to finish the outer edge of the facing from one center front all the way around the neckline to the opposite center front. Then I'll place my center fronts right sides together and pin together from the notch to the bottom of the garment. Then we're going to start our stitching right from where our stitches started and stopped earlier for the facing, right at that notch, backstitching to secure, and sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance to the bottom of the garment. And then you can press that seam open. So now the front of the garment should look like this, and we want to understitch this little V on either side of the facing right at the center front. So once again, we're going to turn that facing over its seam allowance and sew the facing to the seam allowance as far as we can in that V area, doing that on both sides. For the bottoms of our sleeves, we're going to sew basting stitches from one side to the other with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance using the longest stitch on your machine. and leave thread tails on both ends so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Do this for the bottoms of both sleeves. Then we're going to fold the sleeve in half, right sides together with itself, and pin the underarm seam. Doing this for both sleeves. Then sew these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. For the sleeve bindings, I'm going to fold these pieces right sides together and sew the short ends with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Then I'm going to gather the bottom of the sleeve so that the bottom of the sleeve matches the distance around the bottom of the cuff. Then I'll place the right side of my sleeve binding onto the wrong side of the bottom of the sleeve, first matching the seams and pin in place. Then I'll continue pinning all the way around. I've done this for the bottoms of both sleeves. Now I'm going to sew the binding in place all the way around the bottoms of both sleeves with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to open out the binding away from the bottom of the sleeve. I'm going to fold the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the sleeve, and then roll that on top of itself so that the new fold of my binding just covers the stitching line that I stitched previously, and pin in place, continuing that rolling of the binding all the way around. Once I have that pinned in place, I'm going to edge stitch close to that folded edge all around the bottom of the sleeve. Again, doing this to finish both sleeves. For the front and back bodice pieces, I've gone ahead and finished the side seams on both sides separately. Now with right sides together, I'll pin my front and back pieces together at both side seams. Sew both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now with my sleeve right side out and my bodice inside out, place the sleeve and the arm side right sides together, matching the underarm seams and the notches that indicate front and back, and pinning in place. I'll also match the notch at the top of the sleeve with the shoulder seam and pin in place. Sew the sleeve in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and repeat for both sleeves. Here is the inside of the garment where the neckline meets the shoulder seam. Just using a needle and thread, I'm going to tack my facing to the seam allowance of the shoulder seam on both sides of that seam allowance. Just stitching through the edge of the facing and the edge of that seam allowance so that the stitches are invisible from the front of the garment. Doing that for both shoulder seams. The hem allowance for the bottom of the garment is 1 1/4 inches. I'm going to take the bottom raw edge to the ironing board and press the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 inch all the way around. And once that 1/4 inch is pressed, we'll fold it once more to the wrong side by 1 inch and give that a press all the way around. Then we can sew our hem in place, edge stitching close to that inner folded edge all the way around. And now your top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss notifications every time a new video comes out. And I'll see you in the next video.